Hi class, Chapter 6 discusses ways that you will need to analyze your audience when preparing your speeches. And this chapter actually coincides with the homework worksheet that you'll be required to complete entitled the Audience Analysis Worksheet. Good speakers are audience-centered. You'll hear me saying that quite a bit throughout class. They understand that the primary purpose of public speaking is to gain a desired response from their listeners. So you have to think about it that your audience should be foremost in your mind during speech preparation as well as speech presentation. So when you're thinking of how to be audience-centered, you should keep 3 questions in mind when preparing your speeches. To whom am I speaking? What do I want the audience to know, believe, or do as a result of my speech? And how can I most effectively compose and present my speech to accomplish that aim? So it's important for student speakers to approach their classmates as a real audience. Remember what I said in other lectures, you're taking this very seriously because the classroom seems like an artificial speaking situation, and it's easy for students to lose sight of their classmates as an authentic audience. The best student speakers take their audience seriously and treat their classmates as worthy of their best effort. So you want to think about that when you're doing your homework as well. The homework assignment will really help you be audience-centered throughout your speech preparation as well as when you're completing your speeches. Good speakers understand the psychology of audiences. A speaker's task is to make the audience want to pay attention to his or her message. So the perception of audiences is always selective. Everything a speaker says is filtered through a listener's frame of reference. Every speech contains 2 messages, that sent by the speaker and that received by the audience. So you have to think about it that audiences are egocentric. They pay closest attention to the messages that affect them directly. And these psychological principles have 2 important implications for speakers. Listeners will judge a speech on the basis of what they already know and believe. So speakers must take care to relate their messages to an audience's existing knowledges and beliefs. And the next slide will connect directly to your homework on how to do that. So when you do the homework assignment, you're going to analyze the demographic analysis of your audience. And as you review each one, take notes of which demographic group may need to be addressed and why. You can flesh these out later. Right now we're just brainstorming. And for your homework, you might not hit every one, and I'll go over that in class, but you want to think about what demographics do you need to just be aware of. So speakers should consider 6 demographic traits when working on their audiences, because demographic audience analysis is a useful tool to understanding audiences, but it needs to be used properly. So few things affect a person's outlook more than his or her age. Age is definitely a factor, as is gender. Gender issues can have a strong impact on how an audience responds to a speech. The religious views of the audience also need to be considered, and it is also important to adapt to the audience on the basis of sexual orientation, as well as the need to consider the racial, ethnic, or cultural background of audience members. I specifically say cultural background is important in our class because our classes are, we're very lucky that we have such a great mix of different cultures in our audience. Group membership of an audience is another important factor to consider. And there's, a number of groups that you can think about: occupation, economic position, political affiliation, place of residence. That's, all of these you want to think about how they can affect how you're going to prepare and present your speech. So connected to that is the avoidance of stereotyping. When analyzing demographic information about the audience, it is essential to avoid stereotyping. Stereotyping is oversimplified image of a group. It's done by assuming that all members are the same. You definitely want to avoid stereotyping of any group in your audience. The second part of your homework sheet will be analyzing the situational analysis. So demographic audience analysis should always be combined with situational audience analysis, which is why your homework sheet will require you to do both. So this is another stage of audience analysis. It's examining the features of the audience unique to the speaking situation at hand. The first factor to consider is the size of the audience. Our audience is usually around 20 some students. So you won't need a microphone. You don't have to worry about speaking to hundreds of people. The second factor to consider is the physical setting of the speech. Make sure you understand the room setup before you bring in props, before you set up your PowerPoint, before you think about where you're going to stand. The third factor to consider is the audience's disposition towards the topic and disposition towards you. So the disposition towards the topic, a speaker needs to assess the audience's interest in the topic, the audience's knowledge about the topic, and the audience's attitude towards the topic. After that, then you do the fourth factor to consider, which is the audience's disposition towards the speaker. And then finally, the fifth factor to consider is the audience's disposition towards the occasion. You have to think that this is a highly stressful situation for every student who's speaking. So you want to think about that as you are preparing and presenting your speech. So I just want to talk about then the consideration of attitude. These are general evaluations of people, ideas, objects, or events. To evaluate something is to judge it as relatively good or bad, useful or useless, desirable, undesirable. People act in accordance to these attitudes. Our attitudes are the general evaluations we give on people, ideas, object, events, and they're based on our beliefs and they guide our actions. So really, it's our frame of mind. Are we in favor of something or are we not? Are we opposed to something or are we not? This could be people, policies, belief, institutions. And this is extremely important to consider, especially for your persuasive speech, but it really is all of the speeches you do in this class. So you want to evoke some combination of how you're going to hit the audience's attitudes, beliefs, the way we perceive reality, values, how we shape our lives. When you're delivering your speech, it will make your speech more relevant and motivating to your audience. This will be on part 2 of your homework sheet. So you're going to think about how will you do that to hit the attitudes of your audience. Chapter 6 also talks about how do you get audience information. So before you start your speeches, the great thing about our class is everyone's going to do an introductory speech, so you can start to gauge the audience. But there are several ways to get demographic and situational information about the audience. So, for speeches outside the classroom, speakers often make informal inquiries about their audience. But for classroom speeches, some students we're going to talk about our audience analysis in class. So not only are you going to do your own audience analysis, we'll talk in class and you'll start to get to know each other. You also might want to start to think about basic questions. Fixed alternative questions offer 2 or more specific responses. We'll do those in class. Scale questions allow for a continuum of answers, and open-ended questions give maximum leeway in responding. So you want to think about that. We're not going to necessarily be doing questionnaires in our class, but we are going to be gauging information through discussion. So here's just some examples. If you want to start thinking about what questions you want to ask your classmates, here's a fixed alternative. Do you know what the insanity plea is in the U.S. legal system? Yes, no, not sure. You could use fixed alternative questions in your attention getter in your speeches. If you want to gauge your audience's knowledge of something, ask them a yes or no question. You can ask everyone, raise your hand if you know this. Raise your hand if you don't know this. Scales are a little bit harder to do in the speech, but again, you might be able to incorporate them. So how often do you believe the insanity plea is used in U.S. court cases? Very seldom, very often. You might be able to add these into your speeches. Open-ended questions are the hardest ones to think about when you're doing them in your speech, but you could always ask people beforehand if you would like to gauge their opinion. Maybe an open-ended speech about your persuasive argument, maybe an open-ended speech about something you're going to inform. So here's an example. What is your opinion about the insanity plea and U.S. court cases? It sounds like this could be an informative speech or a persuasive speech. So you want to be audience-centered before you do your speech. You want to assess how your audience will respond. Once speakers complete an audience analysis, they will use that to adapt their speech to their listeners. Most of the work of audience adaptation takes place before the speech as part of the preparation process. So you want to think about that as you're preparing your speech. You want to think about everything you know about your audience. A speaker should keep the following questions constantly in mind while preparing a speech. How is the audience likely to respond to what I say? How can I adjust my message to make it clear and convincing as possible? And then after that, you can adjust the message to the audience to require the speakers anticipate how listeners will respond, and you can be creative in thinking of ways to adapt. So how do you adapt during the speech? That's tough because you have everything planned out, but you need to adjust for unexpected circumstances. I'll give you some examples of that in class. I'm not going to do it in this lecture, but you want to maybe watch for feedback. Audience adaptation also takes place during the presentation of the speech. No matter how hard a speaker works ahead of time, things don't always go smoothly on the day of the speech. So skillful speakers learn to adapt to these kinds of changes. So after you read chapter 6 and you listen to this lecture, you are now ready to complete the homework assignment, the audience analysis worksheet parts 1 and 2.